Hi, I'm Ronnie Meek, and welcome to the Unbeliever's Bible Study, Session 11, Joseph. Like his grandfather Isaac, Joseph's life is often held up as a type of Christ. And we're going to look at a little bit of that today. But first of all, let me give you some background and just kind of tell you the story. Jacob had two wives. Jacob, Joseph's father, had two wives and two concubines who bore him children. However, Rachel was his favorite wife, and she bore him Joseph and Benjamin. Joseph was his favorite son because he was Rachel's firstborn. And this was after the others, the two concubines and his other wife, had already borne him 10 sons. And then finally, Benjamin was the last of the 12 sons. When Joseph was 17, he had two interesting dreams from the Lord, which he shared with his family. The first, he shared with his brothers, and he said, I had this dream. We were binding sheaves in the field, and mine stood up, and yours all bowed down and worshiped. Might not have been the wisest thing to share that dream with his brothers, but he did. And then he had another dream, and in this dream he said, the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars were bowing down to me. And at this point, even his father got a little bit put out with him. He said, are your mother and I and all your brothers supposed to bow down to you? Now, I said that he was a type of Christ, and if you listened to the teachings about Jesus in John, you should recall that the things Jesus said, many of the things Jesus said, were outrageous unless they were true. Anyway, this caused his brothers to hate him. He was rejected by his own, much like Jesus. One day his father sent him to his brothers, but when they saw him coming, they planned to kill him. However, they decided it would be better to sell him to a passing caravan, and so he was taken to Egypt, where he was sold as a slave. And the brothers took his coat and killed a goat, dipping the coat in the blood. They then took it to Jacob, who assumed that Joseph had been killed by a wild animal. Well, when Joseph arrived in Egypt, he was sold as a slave to Potiphar, who was an important official. But because the Lord was with him, everything he oversaw prospered. And so Potiphar placed him in charge of the entire household. The only problem was Potiphar's wife was quite attracted to Joseph, but he rejected her advances, and this upset her, and ultimately circumstances aligned where she was able to falsely accuse him, and he ended up in prison. Attraction can easily turn to disgust, and that's apparently what happened here. Anyway, you probably are aware of the fact that Jesus also was falsely accused. But in prison, the Lord was still with Joseph, and the warden ended up placing him in charge of the running of the prison. And this is where he met a couple of men who had been servants of Pharaoh, chief servants of Pharaoh, but they had fallen out of favor with him, and Pharaoh had placed them both in prison. Pharaoh's cupbearer and his baker. And both of them had dreams, and they were very upset about the dreams because they seemed to mean something, but they didn't have anyone to interpret. And Joseph said, don't be upset. Interpretations come from God. Tell me your dreams. And so the cupbearer said, well, I was holding Pharaoh's cup, and I came upon a cluster of grapes, and there were 3 branches. And I took the grapes and I squeezed them into the cup, and I put them in Pharaoh's hand. And Joseph said, well, that's a good dream. That means that within 3 days, you will be restored to your position. Well, the baker liked that interpretation, and he said, well, I had a dream too. I had 3 baskets of bread that I was carrying, and the birds of the air came to try and get the bread, and I shooed them away. And Joseph said, that's not really a good dream, because within 3 days you're going to be lifted up and executed. And it turns out that Joseph correctly interpreted the dreams. The baker was killed within 3 days, and the cupbearer was restored. And it looked like Joseph was finally going to catch a break. But the cupbearer forgot Joseph. You see, it wasn't the right time. 2 years later, Pharaoh had 2 dreams, which no one could interpret. And the cupbearer finally remembered Joseph. He said, "Oh, now I remember. I was supposed to tell you about this guy in prison who can interpret dreams." And so Joseph was brought to Pharaoh, and he gave Pharaoh the interpretation of Pharaoh's dreams. He said, both of these dreams mean the same thing. They mean that there's going to be 7 years of plenty, but they're going to be followed by 7 years of famine, and the plenty is going to be totally forgotten about. Now, here's what I advise. I advise that you store up food during the 7 good years, and then you'll have plenty for the 7 bad years. And Pharaoh said, "Well, I believe that's right. Who could we find to oversee such a thing? Who has wisdom like this man?" And the result was that Joseph was elevated to the second highest position in Egypt. And he was given a wife, and he had 2 sons. And all's well that ends well, except this was hardly the end. When the years of famine came, it not only struck Egypt, it struck many nations. And one of the places where it struck was Canaan. Word reached Canaan that there was food in Egypt. And so Jacob sent the brothers, all of them except for Benjamin, down to Egypt to buy food. And when they came, the 10 brothers bowed before Joseph. He recognized them, but they did not recognize him. Not surprising. He learned that Jacob was still alive and that they had a younger brother at home. Benjamin was Joseph's only full brother. And I guess you could say he played mind games with them, but they deserved it. He accused them of being spies. And the only way they could prove their truthfulness was to return with their other brother. And at this, they remembered Joseph, and they said, "Oh, he pleaded with us, and yet we sold him into slavery, and now we're getting payback." And they didn't understand that Joseph could understand what they were saying, their language. And Joseph wept at the remembrance. Well, he put their money in their sacks when he sent them home with the grain. That kind of freaked them out. But when they got home, they told Jacob what the man had said. "We have to return with our brother." And Jacob said, "No way. I've already lost Joseph. If I lose Benjamin too, it'll bring my gray head down to the grave." Now, Simeon, who was one of the 10, had been kept in Egypt. So he said, "I've lost Joseph. I've lost Simeon. I can't lose Benjamin." But finally, there was no choice because they ran out of food. So they had to allow Benjamin to go, so they returned with Benjamin. And being invited to Joseph's house, the full 11 bowed down to him, fulfilling the dream. And upon seeing his brother, Joseph again wept. And he sent them back with food, and all seemed well, but at Joseph's instruction, his silver cup was placed in Benjamin's sack. And then he sent his servant out after them and said, I've treated you well. Why did you steal the cup that I use for divination?" And the brothers were confronted, and they said, "Well, we didn't steal anything. If the cup is found in anybody's sack, we'll all go back and be your slaves." And they said, "No, just the one in whose sack the cup is found." And so they searched, and of course it was in Benjamin's sack. And they all tore their clothes, and they all returned to face Joseph. And Judah made an impassioned plea: "Take me in Benjamin's place, because if he doesn't go back, my aged father will die. His soul is tied up with the boy." And finally, Joseph revealed his identity to his brothers. They were terrified. As well they might be. But Joseph hugged them and he wept, and especially when he held on to Benjamin, his brother. Well, the brothers return to Jacob, who's finally convinced that Joseph is still alive, and all Israel moves down to Egypt, where they're given the best of the land for as long as Joseph lives. Well, a summary. Joseph, like Christ, beloved of the Father, destined to rule over all. He was sent to his brothers for their welfare, but was rejected by them. Falsely accused, he was imprisoned. Christ was crucified, but both were delivered by God and exalted to the highest place. And by his actions, many lives were saved, not only in Israel, but people from many nations. We also see in this that God's providence can be trusted. The caravan to Egypt came along at just the right time. He was sold to just the right person. And even what seemed to be evil, that he had been falsely accused and was put in prison, he would not have met the cupbearer had he not been in prison. And had the cupbearer not forgotten Joseph for 2 years, he may have been released and not able to be found when the time came that Pharaoh had his dreams and needed interpretation. But the fulfillment of God's plan was not yet come. Genesis starts out with new creation in a garden. It ends with the words, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. The promised one was yet to come. But before him, there would be many others of note. And I hope you'll join me next time as we look at one of the most notable of all, a man named Moses.